The $90 million jet had barely left the runway when the hydraulic system began to fail. Inside the cabin, the young CEO Evelyn believed she was about to die, while on the ground, Jackson, the mechanic she had humiliated and thrown out of the hangar hours earlier, was the only person who understood what was tearing the aircraft apart. He could have turned away, but because 3 pilots and dozens of people below were counting on him, the quiet single father picked up the radio and guided them home. Afterward, Evelyn offered him $1 million. Jackson asked for something else. Stay until the very end to discover exactly what apology Jackson demanded and how it changed the entire company forever. 18 hours before the flight that would change everything, the largest hangar at Auraline Aviation stood lit under rows of white industrial lamps, its concrete floor still cold from the Chicago night. Evelyn was preparing to announce a $2 billion partnership with a group of international investors, and the centerpiece of the evening was a demonstration flight aboard the company's newest aircraft, the Auraline A980, a jet worth $90 million, and built to prove that the company belonged among giants. If the flight succeeded, Evelyn would keep control of the corporation she had inherited, too young to be trusted and too determined to be ignored. If it failed, the board would have every reason it needed to remove her. Jackson worked the night shift as a diagnostic specialist, a title that carried none of the weight of the executives who filled the glass offices above the hangar floor. He wore no suit, attended no strategy meetings, and rarely appeared in any conversation that mattered to the people who ran Auraline. He was a single father who kept his private life folded away from his work, and the only trace of it he carried was a small note tucked inside his wallet. Words meant only for himself, a quiet reminder that he always needed to come home. Nothing about his family ever entered the hangar with him. While inspecting the hydraulic filter of the A980, Jackson noticed something the automated systems had missed: tiny metallic particles suspended where none should have existed. The pressure readings stayed within acceptable limits, but they pulsed in a pattern that repeated itself every 17 seconds, a rhythm too precise to be random noise. The diagnostic computer reported no critical fault. Still, years of experience told Jackson that an absence of warning on a screen was not the same as an absence of danger. It could mean a misaligned isolation valve, or worse, a substandard component quietly warping under heat that had not yet built to its peak. Jackson requested that the flight be delayed so the valve assembly could be pulled and examined properly. Ryan, the younger technician working beside him, grew nervous, aware that the demonstration was only hours away and that if Jackson turned out to be wrong, the entire engineering team would be blamed for disrupting the biggest event of the year. Ryan reminded him that the automated diagnostics had cleared every subsystem twice, and that raising an alarm without solid proof could cost them both their standing inside the company. Jackson answered simply that a fault invisible to a screen was still a fault, and that waiting for proof sometimes meant waiting too long. He had learned that lesson years earlier, watching a colleague dismiss a similar vibration as nothing, only to spend the following months grounded by guilt after a smaller aircraft nearly failed to land. He never wanted to carry that kind of memory again, and he was not willing to let a schedule decide what counted as a real warning. Lisa, who led quality control, saw the metallic particles and immediately recognized them, a pattern she remembered from an old report that had been quietly closed at Connor's instruction. When Jackson asked about that report, Lisa hesitated and looked away, her fear obvious enough that Jackson understood this might be larger than a simple mechanical concern. Connor walked into the hangar at that moment, glanced at the delay order bearing Jackson's signature, and asked in a flat, cutting voice who had given a night shift technician the authority to ground the company's most important aircraft. Connor announced to the hangar that the electronic inspection had already confirmed the A980 was fully airworthy, and that there was no reason for further delay. Jackson explained that the sensors only measured overall pressure, while the real concern sat inside the hydraulic return line, a place no automated system had been designed to watch closely. If the valve assembly seized once temperatures climbed during flight, the failure would only reveal itself after the aircraft had already reached takeoff speed, long past the point where a simple correction could be made. Connor mocked him openly, suggesting that Jackson was relying on instinct instead of data, the kind of thinking that had no place in a modern operation. Lisa nearly spoke up to confirm what Jackson was describing, but she stopped herself the moment Connor turned toward her with a warning look sharp enough to silence the words in her throat. Evelyn arrived at the hangar surrounded by investors and a small media team, visibly irritated to see the jet still sitting untouched instead of being rolled toward the runway. Connor moved quickly, telling her that Jackson was holding up the flight over a signal with no clear evidence behind it, framing the delay as an overreaction from someone unqualified to make that call. Jackson asked Evelyn for 30 minutes to remove the valve assembly himself, offering to accept full responsibility if the inspection turned up nothing. Evelyn asked him directly whether he was certain the aircraft would fail. Jackson answered honestly that he could not promise an accident would happen, but that no one should gamble with human lives simply because the danger had not yet become visible. His caution, offered without exaggeration, was twisted by Connor into a symbol of weakness, framed as a man too afraid to stand fully behind his own warning. Some of the investors exchanged glances, uncertain whether the delay was a sign of thoroughness or disorder, and Connor used their unease to his advantage, insisting that any further hesitation would send the wrong message to the very people the company needed to impress. Standing before dozens of employees, Evelyn ordered Jackson to cancel the delay immediately. Jackson refused to sign off on the aircraft as safe, unwilling to betray what his conscience told him was true. Pressed by the ticking clock and the eyes of investors watching every movement, Evelyn lost her composure and declared that Jackson was using fear to make himself feel important, a line that landed hard across the silent hangar. She ordered security to revoke his access badge and escort him off the property without further discussion. Jackson did not argue. He placed his badge on the table without a word, saying only that an aircraft never cared whether the person warning it wore a suit or a stained work jacket. Quietly, without drawing attention, Ryan photographed the serial number stamped on the valve housing before the jet was towed away for final preparation, telling himself he was only being careful, though some part of him already sensed the number might matter later. Lisa watched Jackson walk out through the wide hangar doors, and though she understood more than she admitted, she still could not find the courage to speak the truth out loud. Standing outside the perimeter fence long after his badge had been deactivated, Jackson listened as the A-90's engines came alive in the distance. Beneath the roar he caught something faint, a low, uneven vibration that no one else on the tarmac seemed to notice at all. Samuel inspected the cockpit instruments and noticed a slight fluctuation in hydraulic pressure. Connor waved it away, insisting it was nothing more than the effect of cold weather on the sensors, and pressed for the flight to continue as scheduled. Samuel wanted to hold the departure a little longer, but Evelyn reminded him that every system aboard the aircraft already carried full certification and that further delay was no longer an option she was willing to consider. Evelyn had not fully settled after her confrontation with Jackson, and a quiet unease still sat beneath her confidence. Still, she feared that canceling the flight now would confirm every doubt the board already held about her leadership, painting her as hesitant at the exact moment she needed to appear certain. The A-90 carried Evelyn, Connor, Samuel, 2 additional crew members, and a small group of investor representatives. No children were aboard the aircraft that afternoon. As Jackson prepared to leave the airport grounds, Ryan came running toward him, holding out the photograph of the valve's serial number. Jackson cross-referenced it against an offline technical manual he kept in his truck and realized the component did not belong to any batch Oralene had ever approved for use. A single character in the part number had been quietly altered, tracing back to a supplier that had once been suspended for using alloys that could not withstand sustained high temperatures. Jackson tried calling Lisa, but she did not answer. He stood beside his truck a moment longer, staring at the photograph on his phone, weighing whether to drive straight to the airport even though his badge no longer worked and no one had asked him to come back. On the runway, the A-90 accelerated toward takeoff speed. By the time Samuel noticed the hydraulic pressure beginning to drop, the aircraft had already passed the point of decision, the speed beyond which aborting the takeoff risked sending the jet skidding off the end of the runway entirely. Samuel had no choice but to pull back on the controls and lift the aircraft into the air. Moments after the landing gear left the ground, a hydraulic warning sounded through the cockpit. The nose gear failed to retract fully, the wing flaps responded sluggishly, and the flight controls began to feel unusually heavy beneath Samuel's hands. Connor still insisted it was nothing more than a faulty sensor reading, unwilling to accept that the very component he had approved might be the cause. His voice, usually so certain, now carried a thin edge of panic he tried hard to hide from the others strapped into their seats around him. Samuel attempted to turn back toward the airport, only to discover that pressure was falling across both hydraulic lines, systems that were supposed to operate completely independently of one another. On the ground, the Technical Control Center could offer no explanation for why two separate systems, engineered never to depend on one another, would fail together in the very same instant, and engineers there began pulling every maintenance log they could find, searching for an answer that made sense. Evelyn found herself replaying every warning Jackson had given hours earlier, and she demanded that Connor bring him back immediately. Connor told her flatly that Jackson had already been terminated and no longer held access to any company system. Samuel cut through the arguments, stating plainly that what they needed now was not someone with authority but someone who actually understood the aircraft they were flying. Jackson's phone rang in his truck. The caller was Evelyn, though for several long seconds after he answered, she could not force herself to say a single word. Evelyn finally spoke, telling Jackson that the hydraulic system was losing pressure and asking whether he could help them, her voice stripped of the certainty she had carried only hours earlier. Jackson did not mention how he had been treated or dwell on the humiliation of that morning. He immediately asked for temperature readings, pressure figures, vibration data, and the current status of every pump aboard the aircraft, moving straight into the only thing that mattered. Connor objected, insisting that internal flight data should never be shared with someone who had already been dismissed from the company. Samuel ignored him completely and relayed every figure directly to Jackson without hesitation. Jackson ran back toward the technical gate, only to find his badge still deactivated and the security staff refused to let him through even with an aircraft in danger overhead. Ryan and Lisa arrived moments later. Lisa used her authority as head of quality control to bring Jackson into the emergency operations center, cutting through the delay with a decision she had been too afraid to make earlier that same day. Walking in, she finally admitted that she had discovered the substandard batch of valves 3 months earlier, and that Connor had claimed at the time they were reserved only for ground testing before pressuring her into closing the report entirely. Jackson realized immediately that one of those same valve assemblies had been installed on the A90, the very component he had tried to pull for inspection before he was ever escorted out of the hangar that morning. He explained that the alloy inside was expanding under heat, causing the return valve to seize, forcing pressure from both hydraulic systems backward into a single shared path, which created the illusion that both systems had failed independently when in truth they were choking on the same blockage. If both main pumps kept running simultaneously, the temperature would climb until it destroyed the entire hydraulic assembly beyond any hope of repair. Jackson instructed Samuel to shut down the primary pump entirely and activate the backup pump only in short, carefully timed bursts. Samuel followed the instruction precisely. Pressure stabilized for the moment, though the aircraft lost part of its ability to control the wing flaps in the process. Connor wanted Samuel to divert toward a military airfield with a longer runway, hoping to keep the emergency away from public attention and away from the cameras that were already gathering near Orleans' own airport. Jackson pushed back hard, explaining that the damaged valve could only withstand the heat for another 40 minutes at most, and the military field was simply too far away to reach safely within that window. Every extra minute in the air, he warned, brought the alloy closer to a failure that no pump cycle could reverse, and there would be no second chance to correct that mistake once it happened. Evelyn now faced a choice between protecting the company's reputation and trusting the very man she had thrown out of the hangar that same morning. She ordered Samuel to return directly to Orleans' own runway, and in the same breath, she handed full technical authority over to Jackson for the remainder of the flight. Jackson quickly built a rough simulation using a hydraulic assembly pulled from another aircraft in the hangar, connecting gauges and a stopwatch across the borrowed parts while Ryan held a flashlight steady over his hands, trying to calculate the exact interval the backup pump could safely run before the valve seized completely. He needed precision now more than ever, aware that guessing wrong could cost every life aboard the jet still circling above the city. Samuel's voice crackled back over the connection, reporting that the left landing gear had finally come down, but the nose gear remained unlocked, and they had only enough fuel remaining for a single safe approach. The airport closed every runway to other traffic. Fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency crews were positioned along the approach, their lights cutting through the gray afternoon sky. News of the aircraft in distress had already begun spreading beyond the airport grounds, and members of the board were calling the operations center without pause, demanding answers no one there could yet provide. Connor insisted that Evelyn limit what information reached the outside world. urging her to prepare a statement blaming the maintenance team for failing to follow proper procedure. Evelyn understood exactly what Connor was preparing to do, positioning Jackson and the rest of the engineering staff as convenient scapegoats for a decision that had never belonged to them in the first place. Jackson stayed focused entirely on his makeshift test rig, tuning out the argument unfolding behind him, aware that every minute spent listening to Connor was a minute stolen from the calculation that actually mattered. He discovered that activating the backup pump for exactly 9 seconds, then allowing it to rest for 17 seconds, could generate enough pressure to force the locking pin into place on the nose gear without pushing the temperature past a dangerous threshold. A single miscalculated cycle, however, risked locking the valve permanently in the wrong position. Jackson guided Samuel to reduce altitude, hold a steady speed, and wait for the system's temperature to drop before attempting the sequence. A sudden crosswind began building near the airport, complicating an already difficult approach and narrowing the margin for error even further. Connor pushed for Samuel to attempt the gear immediately without waiting, but Jackson asked everyone on the line to stay silent so the captain could hear each instruction with complete clarity. Samuel triggered the backup pump exactly as Jackson counted the seconds allowed. The first cycle failed, moving the nose gear only partway into position. The second cycle pushed the temperature dangerously close to its upper limit, and Jackson realized the cockpit display was lagging several seconds behind the true reading inside the system. He adjusted the final cycle down to 7 seconds, accepting a smaller pressure gain in exchange for protecting the assembly from complete failure. The nose gear dropped into place, but the indicator light meant to confirm a full lock never illuminated. Samuel had no way of knowing whether the gear had truly locked or was simply hanging loose beneath the fuselage, ready to buckle the moment it touched pavement. Jackson asked Samuel to fly low across the runway so the ground crew could inspect the gear visually before committing to a full approach. During that low pass, Ryan raised a pair of binoculars and saw the nose wheel shaking violently, confirming that the locking pin had not yet seated correctly. The aircraft now carried only enough fuel remaining for one final approach with no possibility of circling back to try again, a fact Samuel repeated once over the radio, plainly and without panic, so that everyone listening understood exactly what was at stake. Jackson remembered an obscure mechanical trait of the A-90's landing gear, a quirk from an old maintenance bulletin, noting that wind striking the gear housing from a specific angle could sometimes force the mechanism the rest of the way into its locked position during a controlled sideways slip. Samuel warned that such a maneuver was extremely risky given how much control authority the aircraft had already lost. Jackson did not give the order himself. Instead, he laid out the risk plainly and left the decision entirely to Samuel, who still held command of the aircraft regardless of what any voice on the ground might suggest. Trusting the man who had guided him through every step so far, Samuel executed a small, precise sideways slip at exactly the right moment. A hard, jarring impact echoed beneath the fuselage. The nose gear's locking light finally shifted to a steady, confirmed position. But at that very instant, the main hydraulic system lost all remaining pressure entirely, leaving Samuel to bring the aircraft down with incomplete flaps and severely limited braking power. The jet came down onto the runway faster than any normal landing, and Jackson understood in that moment it might not stop before reaching the barrier fence at the far end of the strip. Jackson instructed the fire crews to spread foam across the far end of the runway and clear every vehicle from the path the aircraft might take if it slid past its intended stopping point. He guided Samuel through an asymmetric reverse thrust maneuver to help slow the jet further, warning him to apply it with extreme care so the aircraft would not begin twisting sideways across the pavement. Evelyn sat perfectly still inside the cabin, understanding for the first time that all her power and all her wealth meant nothing against a small mechanical failure that no title could undo. She listened to Jackson's voice over the intercom, steady and unhurried, never once blaming her for what had happened, and never once trying to prove that he had been right from the beginning. Every instruction he gave placed human lives above the value of the aircraft itself, without exception. The A-90's rear wheels touched the runway first, the airframe shuddering violently as the incomplete flaps failed to slow it the way a normal landing would allow. Samuel kept the nose lifted for as long as physically possible, easing the load away from the nose gear that had barely locked into place moments before. When the nose wheel finally settled onto the pavement, the locking mechanism trembled hard but held firm beneath the weight. Samuel engaged reverse thrust, and almost immediately the aircraft began drifting off the center line as one engine responded faster than the other. Jackson told him to ease off the right side, hold steady rudder pressure, and apply the brakes only in short, controlled pulses rather than one long, continuous push. The distance remaining before the end of the runway shrank with alarming speed, and inside the operations center, several people rose from their chairs without realizing it, eyes fixed on the radar display tracking the jet's position. Panic took hold of Connor, and he unbuckled his harness, attempting to push his way toward the cockpit despite the danger of moving through the cabin during an active emergency landing. Evelyn ordered him sharply to sit back down so he would not interfere with the crew trying to bring them all home safely. The jet plowed into the foam laid across the runway and began losing speed, though it continued sliding forward with stubborn momentum. Samuel applied one final measured pulse of braking exactly as Jackson instructed, and the aircraft finally came to a complete stop only a short distance from the barrier fence marking the edge of the airport property. Inside the operations center, several seconds of complete silence passed before a wave of relief broke out across the room, some people gripping the edge of their desks as though they themselves had been holding the aircraft steady all along. Jackson did not celebrate. He immediately told the rescue crews to check for fuel leaks and get everyone off the aircraft without delay, warning that the damaged hydraulic assembly could still ignite if left unattended. Evelyn descended the emergency stairway on shaking legs, and when she spotted Jackson standing at a distance, she started to walk toward him, only for Connor to step between them, insisting that legal counsel needed to control every word spoken from this point forward. Jackson and his team approached the grounded A-90 together, removing the damaged valve assembly and finding the metal inside warped exactly as Jackson had predicted hours earlier. Ryan compared the serial number stamped on the housing to the photograph he had taken that morning, confirming without doubt that it belonged to the unapproved batch Jackson had tried to flag before ever being removed from the hangar. Connor immediately suggested that Jackson might have swapped the valve himself out of spite after being fired, an accusation that struck the crowded hangar into stunned silence. Jackson did not raise his voice or grow defensive. He simply asked how a man who had been stripped of his access badge could possibly have replaced a component on an aircraft under constant, continuous supervision. Lisa stepped forward and admitted openly that she had signed a report about the unapproved batch months earlier, only for Connor to demand that it be quietly closed and forgotten. Connor accused Lisa of lying to protect Jackson, his voice rising with an edge of desperation that had not been there moments before. Ryan then revealed that he had photographed the valve's serial number before the aircraft ever left the hangar that morning, proof beyond question that the faulty component had already been installed, while Jackson was still trying to warn everyone about exactly what it might do. Evelyn ordered the hangar sealed and every maintenance record preserved exactly as it stood. Connor attempted to leave the premises quietly, but security had already been instructed to lock down every gate leading out of the facility. Lisa produced a copy of the old report she had secretly kept outside the company's internal system, evidence showing that 6 substandard valve assemblies had been purchased at nearly half the price of the certified components they were meant to replace. The final approval signature on that purchase belonged to Connor. He tried to justify the decision by claiming the company had been under serious financial pressure at the time, and that the components had technically passed a basic inspection before being installed. He argued that every supplier cut some corners when margins grew thin enough, and that singling him out ignored the broader pressure the entire industry faced that year. Jackson explained plainly that a basic inspection never simulated the extreme heat an aircraft generates during actual flight, a detail Connor already knew because it had been written clearly inside the very report he ordered closed. Financial records later confirmed that the supplier of those components had transferred a so-called consulting fee into an intermediary company connected directly to Connor. His motive had never been to destroy the aircraft or endanger Evelyn's life. He simply wanted to cut costs, inflate the appearance of profit, and quietly collect a hidden commission for himself along the way. When Jackson uncovered the irregularity that morning, Connor had no choice but to remove him from the hangar before the valve could be pulled and examined. Connor had gambled that the short demonstration flight would end before the component ever reached a dangerous temperature. In doing so, he wagered the lives of everyone aboard simply to keep his own failure hidden from view. Evelyn realized that Connor had exploited her deepest fear, the fear of losing control over a company she had inherited far too early to feel fully secure in leading. Still, Jackson refused to let Evelyn see herself only as a victim in what had happened. He reminded her that Connor had only been able to hide the truth because she had built an environment where employees were afraid to speak honestly. It was Evelyn herself who had chosen to trust a title over evidence, favoring the comfort of hierarchy instead of listening to the person who had actually raised the alarm. Lisa admitted that many employees already knew corners were being cut, but no one dared to object after watching others get quietly reassigned or dismissed for raising similar concerns in the past. She described a culture where questions were treated as disloyalty, where the safest career choice had always been to stay quiet and assume that someone above them was already handling the risk properly. Evelyn looked around the hangar and realized that not a single person there could meet her eyes directly. Federal investigators and aviation safety officials soon arrived to collect evidence, and Connor was taken away for questioning on charges connected to fraud, bribery, and knowingly endangering the flight. The board instructed Evelyn not to publicly accept responsibility, warning that any admission on her part could expose the company to significant legal liability. They proposed placing the entire blame on Connor, framing him as a single rogue individual who had somehow bypassed every safeguard the company had built. Several board members argued that shareholders cared only about stability, not confession, and that a carefully worded statement would settle the matter within a news cycle or two. Evelyn turned to Jackson and asked what she should do next. Jackson refused to answer for her. He told her plainly that real leadership only changes when someone chooses what is right on their own, especially when that choice comes at a real personal cost, and that no board memo could substitute for a decision made honestly in front of the people affected by it. Hours earlier, security had escorted Jackson out of this very hangar under Evelyn's own order, and now, standing in that same space, she understood clearly that the crisis had not ended simply because the aircraft had safely returned to the ground. The following morning, Evelyn invited Jackson to a private conference room inside Orleans headquarters. On the table sat a non-disclosure agreement, an offer naming him Vice President of Safety, and a check made out for $1 million. Evelyn explained that the money was a reward for saving the A-90, its crew, its passengers, and the reputation of the entire company. Jackson looked at the check but did not touch it, letting the silence stretch a little longer than was comfortable for anyone else in the room. Evelyn assumed he was worried about strings attached to the money, so she tore the confidentiality agreement in half and assured him he could accept the payment without ever having to stay silent about anything. Jackson still refused. He explained that $1 million could genuinely change his life, the kind of number that could pay off every worry he carried quietly at night, but it could never undo what had happened inside that hangar the day before. Evelyn assumed he wanted more money, or perhaps additional people held accountable beyond Connor alone. Jackson told her simply that all he wanted was one apology. Evelyn immediately apologized to him right there in the conference room. Jackson answered that this was not the apology he needed. He asked her to return to the exact spot where she had once called him a man using fear to make himself feel important, and to say what she needed to say from that same place, in front of the very people who had witnessed the accusation the first time. She would need to apologize before the entire engineering team, not only for humiliating Jackson personally, but for building a culture that had made Lisa and countless others too afraid to speak an inconvenient truth out loud. Jackson made clear that he did not want a statement written by lawyers, no promotional cameras rolling in the background, and no vague promise meant only to smooth things over quickly. He wanted Evelyn to say, in her own words, that she had been wrong, that any employee had the right to halt a flight the moment they sensed real danger, and that no one would ever be punished again for choosing safety over profit. He wanted the people who had watched her humiliate him to also watch her stand there and mean it, without a script, without a handler nearby to soften the language for public consumption. Evelyn warned that a public confession like that could hand the board every reason it needed to remove her from her own position. Jackson answered calmly that this was exactly why the apology mattered more than the check sitting between them. If an apology cost her nothing, it was never anything more than a crisis management tactic dressed up as sincerity. Jackson slid the check back across the table and walked out of the conference room without waiting for a response. The board urged Evelyn to release a carefully neutral statement instead and quietly settle whatever Jackson wanted through a private payment. They insisted that a technician had no standing to set conditions for a chief executive, framing Jackson's request as an overreach beyond his position, an argument several of them repeated with increasing frustration once it became clear Evelyn was actually listening to it. Evelyn stared at the rejected check long after he had gone and realized that Jackson had never once asked for power. He had only asked her to take responsibility in front of the very people she had hurt along the way. By the afternoon, Evelyn called for every employee to gather at the hangar, overriding the board's strong objections without hesitation, telling her assistant simply that some conversations could not wait for permission from anyone else. Hundreds of employees gathered around the A90, still sealed off for the ongoing investigation. There was no elaborate stage, no banners, and no promotional crew present. Evelyn asked every camera brought in for public relations purposes to leave the hangar entirely before she said a single word. Jackson stood near the back of the crowd, still dressed in his worn work clothes, keeping his distance from where the company's leadership normally stood during announcements. Evelyn walked forward to the exact spot where she had once ordered Jackson removed from the building. She admitted that she had chosen convenience over truth, hierarchy over expertise, and the company's image over the lives of the people standing in front of her, and she said it without softening a single word or reaching for a phrase that might make the moment easier for herself. Evelyn apologized directly to Jackson for humiliating him publicly when he had only been trying to fulfill his responsibility to everyone aboard that aircraft. She then turned her apology toward the entire engineering staff, acknowledging that she had taught them, without ever meaning to, that silence felt safer than honesty, and that fear of losing a position had quietly become more powerful inside the company than any written safety policy ever could be. Evelyn stated plainly that Connor's failures did not erase her own responsibility, insisting that a leader could not claim credit during success while shifting every failure onto the people beneath her. She announced that every employee at Auraline would now have the right to halt any flight the moment they identified a genuine risk, without fear of losing their position over it, a promise she repeated twice so that no one standing in the hangar could later claim they had misheard it. Evelyn voluntarily handed temporary operational control to the board while federal investigators examined questions of management responsibility more thoroughly. No one applauded right away. The silence stretched long enough that Evelyn understood trust could never return simply because of a single speech delivered in a hangar, no matter how carefully or how honestly the words had been chosen beforehand. Lisa was the first to step forward, telling Evelyn that an apology could not erase what had already happened, but that choosing to take responsibility publicly was still a meaningful first step towards something better. Ryan glanced toward Jackson, who offered only a small, quiet nod, confirming that Evelyn had done exactly what he had asked of her. Nothing more theatrical, nothing rehearsed, just a plain admission spoken in the same place where the harm had first been done. A few scattered employees began to clap, not to praise their chief executive, but simply to acknowledge that the truth had finally been spoken aloud in front of everyone. Jackson left the hangar before the gathering had fully ended. Evelyn followed him outside and asked whether the apology had been enough. Jackson answered that an apology was never really an ending point. Its true value, he said, would only be proven through the decisions she made starting the very next day. Evelyn watched as the A90 was slowly taken apart piece by piece for inspection, and she decided she would rebuild the entire company using that same approach, stripping away every hidden layer no matter how uncomfortable the process became along the way, however long it took, and however many uncomfortable truths it eventually forced her to face. 3 months later, the investigation confirmed that Connor had accepted illegal commissions and deliberately concealed a serious technical risk from everyone around him. Connor faced formal prosecution, and the remaining substandard components were recalled before they could cause any further incident. Evelyn kept her position as chief executive after a special vote among the board. Many members had wanted her removed entirely, but employee representatives and several major investors backed her plan for a transparent overhaul of the company's culture instead. Auraline created an independent safety board with the authority to halt any flight at any time. Without needing approval from the operations director or anyone above that position, a structure designed specifically so that no single executive could ever again bury a warning the way Connor once had. Lisa became the leader of a new program built to protect employees who came forward to report serious problems, giving them a path that did not depend on the goodwill of whichever manager happened to be listening that day. Ryan received advanced training in system diagnostics, though Jackson reminded him that the most important skill was never spotting a fault first. It was having the courage to speak up when everyone else in the room wanted to stay quiet instead. Evelyn once again offered Jackson a leadership position focused entirely on safety. This time there was no reward check, no confidentiality clause, and no polished title meant to impress anyone. Jackson accepted, but only on the condition that the safety board operate independently, with every risk report stored outside the reach of any single person's control. He accepted an ordinary salary that matched the weight of his new responsibilities, refusing the $1 million payment a second time. Jackson's home life remained mostly out of view, marked only by a small detail suggesting he now returned from every shift a little more punctually than before, a quiet sign that he had never wanted to be seen as a hero, only someone who made sure people came home safely. The A980 underwent extensive repairs and months of careful testing before it was cleared to fly again. During its first test flight, Evelyn did not sit inside the private cabin reserved for executives. She stood in the hangar beside the engineering team, listening carefully to every report without interrupting a single word. Before the aircraft could depart, a young technician noticed a minor irregularity in one of the readings and asked for the flight to be delayed. Rather than showing frustration, Evelyn agreed immediately, insisting the reading be checked thoroughly before anyone proceeded further. Jackson stood nearby, watching quietly. He did not smile because his warning had once again been proven correct. He smiled because, for the first time, an employee had not been afraid to say the aircraft was not ready yet. The jet eventually took off safely once the concern had been fully resolved. Evelyn looked toward Jackson and understood that he had saved Orlean twice over, first by bringing the damaged aircraft safely back to the ground, and second by refusing $1 million in order to teach the company's leadership what it truly meant to take responsibility. Some people never need money to prove their worth. They only need the truth to be acknowledged, so the same mistake never happens again. If this story moved something in you, hold on to the part where a quiet man refused a fortune because a fortune could never buy back respect. Real change never arrives wrapped in money. It arrives the moment someone with power finally stands where they once caused harm and tells the truth without a script to hide behind. Jackson never wanted to be remembered as a hero. He wanted every person who ever raised a warning to be heard the first time, not after disaster forced everyone else to finally listen. That is the story worth carrying forward.